Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. And thanks to Leslie, who recently became a patron. You know, as a patron of this podcast, you get the latest release several days before non-patrons. And depending on your pledge level, you could have unfettered access to our entire back catalogue of chaptered seasons for download. If you would like to become a patron and help support the podcast, then please pop along to Patreon, that's patreon.com/The History Network, and Angus and I have a short video, as well as all the blurb to tell you all about it. We really do appreciate every single one of you patrons. Thank you so much. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 27, Episode 6, Franco-German Rivalry. This episode was written by Simon Keynes. Simon has a degree in geophysics from the University of Lancaster. He started tracing his family history as a child and found that his 3 times great-grandfather, Keynes, was conscripted into the English militia, and he wondered why they were posted to the Yorkshire coast in 1779, which started a deep interest in the effects of the American War of Independence in England. Simon has also researched the actions of another great-grandfather and his brother, who were both killed in the army in France during World War I, and he enjoys battlefield tours and alternative histories. In the First World War, one of the main aims of the French was to retake the lost provinces of Alsace and Lorraine, which had been occupied by the Germans since the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. But this was only one phase of a long cycle of power imbalances leading to invasions and thirst for revenge between these two countries. German nationalists in the 18th century looked way back to the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest in 9 AD, when a Roman army of 3 legions under General Varus was attacked while spread out along forest tracks by a Germanic army led by Arminius. Over several days, some 15,000 to 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed, and only a few escaped to tell the tale. This was one of Rome's greatest defeats. The Romans made several more expeditions across the Rhine, but it was never a permanent part of their territory. After the fall of the Roman Empire, Charlemagne ruled most of northwest Europe. After his death in 814 AD, the lands were split between a much smaller France and the Kingdom of Germany, which extended as far west as the River Rhone and included the area now covered by Alsace, Lorraine and parts of the Netherlands, forming the First Reich. The French state was too weak to attempt any expansion, with religious wars, several independent duchies, and fighting the 100 Years' War with England. But in 1618, the 30 Years' War broke out in Germany. Some 25% to 40% of the German population were killed or fled, and the country was devastated. At the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, Germany consisted of 300 small principalities. France, under Louis XIV, was now the dominant power, and in a series of wars and treaties gradually took Alsace, parts of Lorraine, and finally annexed the rest of Lorraine in 1766. The border between France and Germany was now the River Rhine, from Switzerland north past Strasbourg and Hagenau, then turned northwest to follow the River Saar for a stretch and continued to Luxembourg. This had moved the French border to a strong position on the River Rhine, considered to be France's natural border, ignoring the fact that the population were German. There would be almost 200 years of battles across this border between Luxembourg and the Rhine. French expansion reached its maximum under Emperor Napoleon, who invaded Prussia in 1806 and crushed their army at the Battle of Jena. At the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807, half of the territory of Prussia was given to France. The rest of the kingdom was occupied. The Prussians had to pay a tribute or indemnity of 154 million francs and pay the costs of billeting French troops. The economy was in ruins. The Prussians had to enter an alliance with France, including taking part in the disastrous invasion of Russia in 1812. After this defeat of the French army, the Prussians felt able to defy Napoleon and declare war on France again. Their army helped to defeat the French in 1814 and again at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815. After the defeat of Napoleon, some of the German-speaking lands on the west bank of the Rhine were given back to the German Confederation. In 1840, the French government claimed these lands, provoking the Rhine crisis and stirring up more angry feelings on both sides. During the rest of the 19th century, Germany was gradually reunified as Prussia formed the North German Confederation. German nationalism was fed by hatred of the French, due to their treatment in the Napoleonic Wars, and the victorious Germanic leader Arminius from 9 AD, who had been renamed Hermann, was commemorated with a giant 53-metre-high statue near the site of his battle, facing west towards any new invader. The French population became alarmed at Prussian expansion, particularly the defeats of Denmark in 1864 and Austria in 1866. Austria was crushed in only 7 weeks. The most important battle was Königgrätz, also known as Sadowa. At this battle, initially the Prussian had only half as many men on the battlefield as the Austrians, but they had a much superior rifle, the needle gun. When the second half of the Prussian army arrived on the battlefield, the Austrians were beaten. France stayed neutral in this war, but the French people were very sympathetic to the victims of the Prussians and demanded revenge for Sadowa. It seemed it would only take one spark to start a war, and this spark was to be just a slightly edited telegram, the so-called Ems telegram. After the Spanish Revolution of 1868, Queen Isabella was forced to leave the country. The Spanish government looked for a new regent from across Europe. One candidate was Prince Leopold of Hohenzollern, who was related to the Prussian King Wilhelm. The French Emperor Napoleon III, nephew of Napoleon I, protested at this. He did not want France surrounded by 2 countries ruled by German royalty. Prince Leopold had to withdraw, which was a diplomatic embarrassment for Prussia, but the French government further demanded that the king would never again support Prince Leopold as candidate. On the 13th of July 1870, the French ambassador happened to meet the king informally in Kurpark in the city of Ems and pass this on. The king was annoyed to hear this further demand after the candidate had been withdrawn. He acted politely, but said he could not give a guarantee like this for an infinite time. In a telegram from the king to the Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, he said he had nothing more to say to the ambassador, presumably meaning just about this matter, and asked Bismarck to prepare a press release on the conversation. Bismarck wrote a shorter telegram, making the exchange seem more angry and saying that the king refused to see the ambassador again. Historians have argued about why Bismarck made these changes, but the result was dramatic. 6 days later, the French declared war, and on the 31st of July, the French army crossed the river Saar to take the German town of Saarbrücken, with 86 casualties. The French had planned a major advance across this stretch of the border between Luxembourg and the Rhine, heading northeast towards Berlin. This was dropped in favour of moving into the southern German states, hoping they would join in a revenge war with Austria against Prussia. Unfortunately, the southern states came to the support of Prussia, and Austria stayed neutral. The Prussian army mobilised much quicker than expected and was soon approaching, so the French withdrew back across the border in a few days. This was their sole success in the war, but because the French had declared war and attacked first, they were seen as the aggressor. They had no support from any other country and had to suffer all the consequences. The Prussians won 3 battles near the French border between Luxembourg and the Rhine, then trapped 160,000 French troops in the fortress of Metz. On the 2nd of September they encircled another French army, personally led by Emperor Napoleon III at Sedan, and 104,000 soldiers surrendered. The Prussian army was much better led and made great use of fast-moving cavalry and horse artillery to outmanoeuvre the French. The French had no longer-range rifles, but the Prussian artillery had a much longer range than the French. The city of Paris was besieged for over 4 months, and the government finally had to surrender on the 27th of January, 1871. The Prussians had used the Palace of Versailles as their headquarters to add insult to injury. In November 1870, prompted by the French declaration of war, 4 southern German states had agreed to join the North German Confederation, which was renamed the German Empire, the Second Reich, and Wilhelm was crowned as emperor at their headquarters in Versailles while Paris was under siege. This reunification was a great result for Germany as a result of the war. Under the Peace Treaty of Frankfurt, the French had to pay an indemnity of 5 billion francs, which was exactly equal to the indemnity per person that Prussia had to pay France in 1807, getting their revenge. The Prussians also annexed most of Alsace and part of Lorraine and held them for the next 47 years. The army asked for this annexation to make it more difficult for the French to attack Germany in the future. In the south, the border was moved west to the Vosges Mountains. In the north, the Germans occupied the border territory that the French had attacked from, and the annexed territory extended west to the great fortress of Metz. The German government justified the takeover by claiming that most of the people spoke German and produced maps highlighting all the German place names. However, many German politicians, including Bismarck, warned against taking these territories, foreseeing that it would lead to another war with France. The population were given the choice of leaving or take German nationality, or stay but keep their French nationality. Around 10% opted to stay French. The Germans made it difficult for French citizens to visit. For instance, French businessmen arriving by train had to have their meetings in the station. They also banned any new French language signs being put up, or even repainting the old signs, and many other petty and annoying regulations. Up to 500,000 people left to go to France, while Germany sent in around 400,000 immigrants or colonists. In France, initially, there was a great desire for revenge, revanchisme. Schoolchildren were taught about the lost provinces, and the statue representing Strasbourg was veiled in black. The French people gradually lost interest in the cause, but in the build-up to the First World War, the French Plan 17 was to move into Alsace-Lorraine, back towards the old frontier. The Germans carried out the Schlieffen Plan at the outbreak of the war, designed to defeat the French and British before their Russian allies could mobilise. The Germans attacked through Belgium, aiming a wide light hook down towards Paris and planning to trap the remains of the French army against the German border. By advancing across the border into Lorraine, the French army were actually going deeper into the Germans' trap. The French attacked immediately after war was declared, and by the 19th of August had taken Mulhausen and Colmar near the Rhine, and advanced a few miles northeast along a broad front, capturing Sarrebourg. It was probably fortunate that the Germans had modified the Schlieffen Plan and taken troops from the right wing to defend Alsace-Lorraine under their commander, Crown Prince Ruprecht. He was under orders to only hold the French, but he disobeyed and counter-attacked on the 20th of August, pushing the French back towards Verdun. So Alsace-Lorraine stayed in German hands throughout the First World War, and the population were treated more harshly in case any of the civilians tried to act as partisans. Speaking French was forbidden. The front line ran over the Vosges mountains as foreseen in 1871. Finally, the Germans surrendered and the ceasefire was declared on the 11th of November 1918, with an agreement signed in a railway carriage, part of General Foch's mobile headquarters in the forest of Compiègne. Terms were agreed by the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This time the Germans had to pay reparations of 132 billion marks. They had to accept full blame for the war, their armed forces were severely restricted, and the Rhineland was occupied. Some thought this was a fair outcome, others worried that Germany would once again seek revenge for these surrender terms. The French Marshal Ferdinand Foch stated, "This treaty is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years, which was incredibly accurate. The treaty, of course, included Alsace-Lorraine becoming French again, and 111,000 Germans were expelled from the provinces. The German language was forbidden, and cities were renamed to a French spelling. German troops were banned from all territory within 50 kilometres east of the Rhine, but the French government still feared that Germany would one day go to war again, so constructed the Maginot Line from the Swiss border to the Belgian border from 1929 to 1938. The main line started only 10 kilometres from the German border. It was hoped to either delay a German attack or force them to invade through Belgium, where they could be stopped without a long war in France. In March 1936, the German army marched back to the Rhineland in violation of the treaty. Thousands of French troops moved to the German border and could have easily defeated Hitler's Third Reich, but finally did not cross the border, and the opportunity was lost. The Germans were now free to start building their own border fortifications, the Siegfried Line, although construction really only got going later in August 1944, as the Allied armies approached the frontier. The Second World War was started on the 1st of September 1939 with the German Third Reich invasion of Poland. It is often forgotten that the French army attacked with 11 divisions across the German border on the 7th of September on either side of Saarbrücken in a near repeat of their 1870 attack. This should have been a good opportunity with most of the German army in Poland, but the French only advanced 5 miles at most. They retired on the 21st of September after the fall of Poland released the German army. In May 1940, the Germans advanced into Belgium and the Netherlands, drawing the Allied armies forwards, then launched their main drive through the Ardennes and quickly reached the English Channel coast, forcing the evacuation at Dunkirk. The German army then turned southwest, but the remaining French army put up a strong defence despite only having half as many divisions left as the Germans, so it was another 2 weeks before Paris fell. Most of the troops had finally been moved out of the Maginot Line forts. The Germans launched 7 divisions to finally capture the Maginot Line, but the remaining skeleton units put up a very tough resistance, so that the last fort only surrendered on the 10th of July. Another 5 German divisions crossed the Rhine and pushed the French troops into the Vosges mountains, where they were surrounded. After the fall of France, Hitler insisted on the French surrender being signed in the same railway carriage at exactly the same spot in the forest of Compiègne to make his revenge complete. The armistice site was then destroyed 3 days later, as if to make sure there would never be another defeat. All the costs of the German occupation had to be paid by the Vichy government, 400 million French francs per day, which is estimated to be 50 times the actual cost of the garrison. Alsace-Lorraine was again declared to be part of Germany, with some 140,000 men forced to serve in the German army under threat of having their families deported. They called themselves the Malgré nous, meaning against our will. France was only fully liberated early in 1945. By the end of 1944, the US 8th Army and French 1st Army had liberated the whole of Alsace-Lorraine and expelled the Germans from French territory except for a small pocket on the west bank of the Rhine, south of Strasbourg, the Colmar Pocket. The last German attack on French soil took place during the height of the Battle of the Bulge on New Year's Eve 1944. The Americans had to pull troops north to oppose this, so the US 7th Army was stretched more thinly. Operation Nordwind was a German attack back across the French frontier, just east of the old battlegrounds around Saarbrücken, eventually advancing up to 20 miles as far as Hagenau during January 1945. The Americans had made good use of the Maginot Line bunkers and fortifications to hold the Germans. The plan had been to advance further south and link up with the Colmar Pocket to trap the Americans against the Rhine, and Hitler was keen to recapture Strasbourg, the capital of Alsace. General Eisenhower suggested pulling back safely to the Vosges mountains and abandoning Strasbourg, but the French government absolutely refused because it had changed hands 4 times in the past century, a symbol of what the French were fighting for. The Colmar Pocket was finally taken on the 9th of February. The last German troops were off French soil. After the Germans' surrender, the same cycle of revenge seemed to be repeating again. An early plan was to remove all industry from the Ruhr, and Churchill looked forward to converting Germany into a country primarily agricultural and pastoral in its character. Secretary of the Treasury Henry J. Morgenthau wanted Germans to be fed 3 times a day with soup from army soup kitchens. Reparations were again being paid to the victors, but in the form of industrial plant and labour. However, with the creation of the Communist Eastern Bloc, it seemed obvious that the West needed a strong West Germany on the border. Marshall Plan aid was extended to West Germany in 1948. In 1950, French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman proposed a radical new plan to stop the cycle of wars and revenge between France and Germany, forming a European coal and steel community to make war not only unthinkable but materially impossible. For the first time in history, these 2 countries would be part of an alliance, and the nations are finally at peace with each other. Well, thank you, Simon, once again for writing that episode for us. It's great to have another script from you. If you're listening and you think you'd like to write a script for us, then just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org, and we'd love to hear your ideas. Once again, if you haven't become a patron yet of the podcast and would like to do so, just pop along to patreon.com/The History Network and see what we're doing there with our Patreon campaign. Thank you so much again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Simon Keynes, read by Nick Barker.